Welcome to Sherlock Shadow Channel, where every story hides a secret. Grab your coffee, sit back, and dive into a world of twists and turns. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot and the Book That Ended in Murder. Chapter 1. The last chapter. The literary club of Les Belles Lettres, on the outskirts of Lyon, was an elegant retreat where tea was served on antique china. The gatherings were quiet but fierce, and the walls were lined with shelves of books that no one dared take out. Founded by the late Marquise de Champfleury as a sanctuary for high culture, the club welcomed only those who had published a work deemed worthy of posterity. That October afternoon, the tranquility of that place was about to be shattered forever. At 6 o'clock sharp, Madame Audrey Vallon, historical novelist and chairwoman of the selection committee, was found slumped over the mahogany table in the private reading room, a brown, leather-bound copy still in her hands. Her face, pale and drawn, was turned toward an Art Deco chandelier, whose flickering light seemed to mock the stillness of death. No one heard screams. No one saw the killer enter or leave. The door was locked from the inside. The title of the book lying beneath his icy fingers was disturbing. The final confession. The most disturbing thing wasn't the title, but that its author, Albin Marul, had submitted the manuscript to the club just 3 days earlier, as his last work before retiring from writing. The manuscript, it was said, contained a crime, real or fictional, that had disturbed even the most seasoned members of the committee. "It looks like a natural death," said Inspector Girard, scratching his chin in a bored manner as the doctors examined the body. But that impression was shattered when Dr. Delorme found traces of digitalis in an unfinished cup of tea. "Foxglove poison?" Girard exclaimed. "Who the hell uses that these days?" The room was tidy. No signs of a struggle. The cup was untouched. The only item out of place was a fresh ink stain in the corner of the book. There was no letter, no note. Only the silence of a constructed, almost theatrical scene, as if someone had tried to compose a final act. There were only 3 people present in the building when the death occurred. Albin Marul, the author of the manuscript, a reserved man with a reputation for being a cynic and misanthrope. He had had public disputes with Audrey Vallon over the overly realistic content of his novels. Sibylle Fournier, a promising young poet, disciple of Vallon and protégé of several influential members of the club. She always carried a notebook and an antique quill pen. She had been excluded from the club's latest annual publication. Etienne Bernet, a nervous middle-aged editor with a reputation for ambition. He maintained an ambiguous professional relationship with the victim, who would often recommend or ruin authors at will. All 3 denied knowing anything. None of them saw anything. Each seemed more interested in preserving their reputation than in cooperating. And it was then that from Paris, an unexpected visitor arrived. "Mr. Poirot," Inspector Girard said, raising an eyebrow. "What brings such an illustrious gentleman to Lyon?" "Ah, my dear Inspector," Hercule Poirot replied with a slight bow. "I received a letter from Madame Vallon just 4 days ago. She asked me to review a manuscript which, she said, contained a truth as dangerous as it was elegant. I was to meet with her this very afternoon." His soft, musical Belgian accent resonated gravely in the room. Poirot walked slowly toward the body, examined the book without touching it, observed the spilled ink, the angle of the cup, the arrangement of the furniture. "Were you alone?" he asked. "According to them, yes," Girard said, pointing at the 3 suspects. Poirot didn't reply immediately, He went to the window overlooking the silent garden. He watched the falling leaves, and then, without looking at anyone, he murmured, "Someone wrote his crime in words before committing it with poison." Girard frowned. "Are you implying that the manuscript has something to do with this?" "I'm not implying it, monsieur. I'm affirming it. The murderer didn't just want to kill. He wanted to narrate the murder before carrying it out, as if the real death were the adaptation of a carefully planned fiction, a final chapter, with real blood." Girard snorted, but Poirot turned on him with a look so sharp that it made him take a step back. "I beg you, Inspector, that no one touch that manuscript. Not a word, not a page. That book is a confession in the form of art." Poirot leaned elegantly towards the cup and repeated in a low voice, "Why is there only one cup if there were supposed to be two?" The three suspects exchanged fleeting glances. "It's a literary crime," Poirot concluded. "And like every good book, it begins with a prologue loaded with meaning. And so, while the police were still unsure whether it was a murder, Poirot was already delving into a case where ink, memory, and the artist's egos would become intertwined with death. Chapter 2. Those Who Read Too Much. The next morning, the Les Belles Lettres Club found itself under an atmosphere even denser than the red velvet curtains hanging over its high windows. The reading room, normally a refuge for literary murmurings and suppressed egos, had become a scene of subtle tension, where every word carried more weight than it said, and every glance carried suspicion. Hercule Poirot presented himself impeccably as always, his symmetrical moustache a declaration of war against chaos. He took a seat in the adjoining room, a private library where he now awaited each of those present during Madame Vallon's death. He needed no threats or authority. His mere presence, as carefully controlled as a classical poem, was enough to let everyone know that the game of appearances was over. The first to be called was Albin Mareuil. He entered with a slow, almost nonchalant gait. He was dressed in black, with a dark grey scarf, as if he were mourning an idea, not a person. He sat down opposite Poirot without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Mareuil," Poirot began in a terse voice, "thank you for coming. You were, I understand, the last to submit a manuscript for review by the committee." "Correct," Mareuil said, crossing his legs. "The final confession. A fiction, if that helps your research. A fiction in which I've been told a crime appears." Mareuil smiled humorlessly. "Is there any good novel without a crime, Monsieur Poirot? At least, literary speaking." Poirot leaned forward, his grey eyes fixed on Mareuil's. "And would you say that Mrs. Vallon was offended by its content?" "Offended?" Mareuil raised his eyebrows. "She was furious. Not because of the crime, but because she thought she recognized real figures in my fiction. She claimed I had plagiarized the lives of the club members. Had he done it? Let's just say we authors are indiscreet observers, and Audrey had many masks. Fascinating to remove." Poirot remained silent for a second longer, gauging the coldness with which Mareuil spoke of a woman who had died just a few hours earlier. "Where exactly were you between 5 and 6 o'clock yesterday afternoon?" "Reading in the conservatory. I used to avoid the arguments that committee meetings provoked. Ask Mrs. Fournier. She saw me go by." Poirot let him go without further questions, but made a mental note of a word that Mareuil had said almost without thinking. Masks. Sibylle Fournier was next. Her youth contrasted with the antique furniture, like a lily in a Gothic church. She wore a cream dress with mother-of-pearl buttons and held her notebook against her chest like a shield. Mademoiselle Fournier, Poirot said gently, you were present at the club during Madame Vallon's death. Could you tell me exactly where? In the small living room, correcting a poem. I didn't see or hear anything, until someone screamed. Who shouted? I think Etienne. He was the one who found the body, wasn't he? Poirot nodded. He knew Fournier was right. The preliminary report indicated that the editor had been the first to enter the room after noticing that Vallon hadn't come to dinner. Did you have a close relationship with Mrs. Vallon? Sibylle looked down. She was supportive, at first. She said I had a poetic voice that hurt like a secret. But lately she'd been more critical. She rejected me from the literary yearbook this year. She said I still lacked maturity. And how did that make you feel? Sibylle pressed her lips together. I admired her. But I no longer understood her. She was harsh and sometimes cruel, especially to those who didn't look like her. Poirot looked at the notebook the young woman was holding. He noticed a crumpled page, bent as if it had been violently scratched out. Can I see it? She hesitated, but handed it to him. Poirot skimmed through it without reading aloud. One verse stood out. And the poison doesn't kill him, it reveals him. He handed the notebook back without comment, but his eyes narrowed only slightly. Etienne Bernet, he arrived last. He was visibly shaken. His fingers trembled slightly as he buttoned his jacket. Monsieur Bernet, said Poirot, it was you who found the body, wasn't it? Yes, of course. I was surprised Audrey didn't show up for dinner. I went looking for her. I found her like this. Poirot waited. As well as? Dead. With the book. I didn't touch anything, I swear. Did you know the contents of the manuscript? Bernet quickly denied it. I've never read it. Audrey said it was offensive. I was planning on rejecting it immediately. Poirot didn't press him. He observed the way he spoke. Anxious, nervous, but not particularly hurt. And you, sir? Did you have anything to lose if Madame Vallon disappeared? Bernet seemed to pale. Me? Nothing. First period. Well, yes, we had arguments about new authors. She was very purist, too strict, but I would never have hurt her. Poirot leaned back. Purity and severity can create enemies as dangerous as envy. Thank you, Mr. Bernet. Left alone, Poirot stood up and walked slowly around the empty room. Then he headed back to Madame Vallon's body, now in the club's refrigerated room, under police guard. He looked at the cup. He examined the book, with gloves. He reached into the victim's coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled note, a hastily written message. If something happens to me, the ending is not fiction. Poirot closed his eyes for a few seconds. He murmured, she knew, or at least she suspected. But who did she fear more, the pen or the reader? Chapter 3. The Missing Page. Midday brought with it a fine, persistent rain that caressed the windows of the Club Les Belles Lettres, as if trying to erase the secrets of the previous day. Hercule Poirot, punctual as a Swiss pendulum, was in the office of the late Audrey Vallon. It was not a room open to the public. He needed a special order from Inspector Girard, who, although skeptical of the Belgian detective's methods, had begun to understand that with Poirot, the smallest details were the gateways to the biggest crime. The office was a sanctuary of order. The shelves were organized by genre, publisher, and even by the cover font. An Empire-style bronze lamp cast a warm light over an antique desk where meticulously stacked papers lay. However, there was one minimal, barely perceptible disturbance, a gap between two labeled folders. New readings. Just enough space for a thin object, like a manuscript. Poirot took a white handkerchief from his pocket and ran his gloved fingers over it. Something had been there, recently. Girard appeared in the doorway, dripping water from his hat. "Are you looking for a pistol, Monsieur Poirot? Because you'll only find adjectives here." "No, no," said Poirot without turning around. "I'm looking for absences. They are more revealing than presences. There was a manuscript missing here, one that Madame Vallon guarded with particular care. Why remove it now?" Girard frowned. "Do you think someone came in after the death? Or just before? What better way to manipulate a literary crime than by editing the text?" Poirot approached a locked filing cabinet. He lightly forced open the drawer. It didn't open. He searched for the key at the bottom of the desk. Nothing. Then, as he looked at the framed portrait of Madame Vallon, an oil painting with a stern expression and a searching gaze, he noticed something strange. On the back of the frame, a small hook. He turned it. Click. The back of the desk opened with a soft creak. A secret compartment. Inside, a green leather folder with the club seal. He opened it carefully. It was an incomplete draft of the final confession. Poirot examined its numbered pages. The progression was logical, up to number 117. Then came 119. "Ah," whispered Poirot, "the missing page." Girard approached, now intrigued. "A torn leaf? Not torn out, deliberately removed. There's no tear. It's possible the perpetrator was afraid of what that page revealed. Perhaps it was too similar to a real scene." Girard clicked his tongue. "Wouldn't it be easier to burn it?" Poirot shook his head. "A murderer who's also a writer doesn't destroy words, he hides them. Fiction is his alibi, his stage, his mask. Deleting a page would be like leaving the curtain without the final act." That afternoon, Poirot summoned the 3 suspects to the club's library. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. It was a psychological move. Everyone arrived on time, as if obeying an invisible score. "My friends," said Poirot, speaking without preamble, "I've read the manuscript. Well, part of it. 1 page is missing, number 118. And I have reason to believe that this page described a crime that was too close to reality." "Are you implying that someone wrote down how they would kill Audrey and then did it?" Mareuil interrupted with a sarcastic laugh. Poirot stared at him. "I'm not implying. I'm asking, who had access to the complete manuscript?" Silence. "What if the missing page isn't Mareuil's?" Sibylle said suddenly. "Albin never submitted the complete text. He always said the version sent to the club was an adaptation." "That's true," Mareuil said. "I don't usually hand in my final drafts. Only the essentials. Perhaps Audrey had access to more, through other means." Bernet, who had remained silent, intervened in a low voice. "Audrey was obsessive. She used to keep duplicates of everything, even work she rejected. Maybe. She did have a complete version. Maybe someone knew." Poirot nodded, like someone picking up the pieces of a puzzle with slow but steady hands. "So the question is, who knew Audrey had the final chapter? And even more so, who was afraid she'd read it?" As night fell, Poirot requested one last thing: to search the desks of the 3 suspects, all located in the members' wing of the club. With the inspector's permission and under supervision, he entered Mareuil's first, chaotic, filled with scattered notes, incomplete sentences, and underlined quotations. Sibylle's was different, orderly, sensitive. A framed poem, notes with Vallon's corrections written in red. But it was in Etienne Bernet's desk that Poirot found something peculiar: a crumpled sheet of paper, among other nondescript documents. It bore the number 118 in one corner. Poirot unfolded it. The text was brief, but powerful. It described a severe, powerful woman who discovered that her life had been transcribed without permission, and how, upon confronting the author, this woman unwittingly drank her last sip of judgment. Poirot read it silently. Then, without saying a word, he slipped the page into his inside pocket. That evening, in his room at the small hotel in Lyon, Poirot sat by the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of ink and suspicion. In his notebook, he wrote 3 names. Under each, a possible motive. Albin Mareuil, to take revenge on a fierce critic. Sibylle Fournier, literary betrayal and humiliation. Etienne Bernet, editorial rise after a fall. Then he underlined a line. One of them wrote death, but only one dared to turn fiction into action. Chapter 4, The Invisible Signature. The next morning Poirot appeared at the Club Les Belles Lettres, with the impeccable gait of a man who already knew the end of the book, though he wasn't yet ready to share it. In his inside pocket, protected by a grey linen folder, lay page 118, that page that had disappeared not by mistake, but out of fear. However, Poirot did not address Inspector Girard or the suspects. Instead, he requested access to the club's correspondence archive. A simple excuse. An investigation must reconstruct the context, monsieur. Girard, resigned, handed him the key to the archive without much protest. The archive was a cool, dusty basement. Wooden shelves held letters, invitations, contracts, and special editions signed by deceased authors. In a section labeled Correspondence, Audrey Vallon, committee members Poirot, found what he was looking for. Letters from the club's president to the 3 suspects. Private correspondence, much of it recent, and in them new pieces of the puzzle. The first letter, addressed to Sibylle Fournier, was warm, almost maternal. Dear Sibylle, you know I believe in your talent, but poetry needs silence before it needs shouting. I invite you to read Mareuil's manuscript. Perhaps you will find in it the mirror you don't want to look into. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Had Audrey asked him to read the manuscript? Why? The second letter for Etienne Bernet was colder. I'm not convinced by your recent editorial decisions. You seem willing to publish anything to gain prominence. If you approve this manuscript without reading it thoroughly, you can no longer count on my support. And the third, for Albin Mareuil, was the most disturbing. It wasn't handwritten, but typed, but in the margin there was a line added in ink. The truth you hint at in your final chapter isn't yours, and it will cost you more than just expulsion from the club. Poirot held that letter for several minutes. Then he closed his eyes. The game was clear. The manuscript wasn't simply a literary work. It was a battlefield. Every word a spear. Every omission a silent shot. At noon, Poirot returned to the main hall, where Girard was reviewing the preliminary laboratory reports. Nothing in the cup except traces of digitalis, but no container containing the substance has been found at the club. So it was brought in from outside. In small doses, it can be easily hidden. In a perfume bottle. In a fountain pen. Poirot walked to the table where Audrey Vallon had been found dead. There, under the lamp, was the book. And beside it, something that had been overlooked, an embroidered silk handkerchief. In one corner, a stylized lettering S. Was this collected as evidence? Girard shook his head. I thought it was the victim's. Number Audrey didn't use embroidery. Her style was more austere. This is Sibylle's. Girard opened his mouth to reply, but Poirot interrupted him. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. A forgotten handkerchief isn't the same as a confession, but it is a signature. One of those invisible ones that The killers don't know they've left behind. Poirot then decided to speak to Sibylle again. He found her sitting alone in the club's conservatory, scribbling something in her notebook. "Mademoiselle," he said politely, "may we talk for a moment?" She looked at him without surprise, as if she had been expecting the visit. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. I found a handkerchief of hers in the room where the death occurred." Sibylle was unfazed. "I could have left at any time. Mrs. Vallon and I spent many afternoons there." Poirot sat down beside her. He looked at her nervous, spiral handwriting. "You read Mareuil's manuscript, right?" Sibylle hesitated for only a second. "Yes. Audrey gave it to me. She said I'd understand something important if I read it." "And did you understand it?" She looked down. The final chapter was cruel. It spoke of a domineering woman who destroyed young talents to feel necessary. It was her, Audrey. And I saw myself reflected in the fictional victim, in the humiliation, in the rage. Poirot said nothing. He waited. "I didn't hate her, monsieur, but I felt used. As if her affection were an experiment on her vanity. Her rejection hurt me and others. But no, I didn't kill her." Poirot nodded slightly. It wasn't his style to force a confession, but his little grey cells were beginning to form a clearer picture. Later, Poirot met Mareuil on the covered terrace. The writer was reading the newspaper as if the world were a bad essay. "Enjoying the media coverage of the crime you perhaps predicted?" Mareuil smiled, without looking up. "It's not the first time reality has followed my words, but this time it was too accurate. And aren't you worried that this accuracy might make you a suspect?" "Monsieur Poirot," he replied, folding the newspaper, "all of us who write about death are suspected of understanding it only too well. But understanding is not doing. Was the missing page yours?" "Yes, but I withdrew it before submitting it. I didn't want to turn fiction into prophecy. Or at least, that's what I thought." Poirot looked at him for a long time. "You removed it, but someone else found it." At night in his room, Poirot unfolded page 118 on his bed. The ink was fresh, but dry enough to indicate it had been packed away in haste. In the lower corner, a small symbol. 2 intertwined letters, barely perceptible. Ibby Poirot smiled. It wasn't the signature of a literary assassin. It was the mark of a publisher. And while the city of Lyon slept, Poirot traced the final movements of a crime that began not with poison, but with a correction on the side. Chapter 5. The Ghost Editor. The morning dawned with a thick, humid air, as if the city itself were holding its breath. At the Club Les Belles Lettres, the usual murmur of porcelain cups and discussions of metaphors had completely disappeared. In its place hung a dense, expectant silence, as if before an important announcement. The murder of Audrey Vallon had ceased to be a literary tragedy and had become an enigma demanding answers, and everyone knew that only one man could find them. Poirot, punctual as ever, appeared with his usual composure, but something new shone in his eyes, a quiet certainty. He had spent the night tying up loose ends, not with conjecture, but with words, forgotten words, crossed-out words, or signed in the corner of a page. In his jacket, carefully folded, lay the quietest evidence of all, page 118 of the lost manuscript, with the initials E.B. written in barely perceptible, but unmistakable, black ink. Etienne Bernet. The name had been on his mind from the start, not because of her nervous demeanor or her access to the club, but because of something more subtle. his desperate need to stay relevant. In a world where editors depended on Audrey Vallon's opinion to survive, his disagreement with her was more than professional. It was existential. Poirot headed to the editorial office, a more modest space than Vallon's, with less marble and more recycled paper. Bernet was waiting for him behind a pile of unopened manuscripts. He tried to appear relaxed. "Monsieur Poirot, have you discovered anything new?" "Maybe. A small detail. And you know how I feel about small details." Poirot sat down, uninvited, and placed the grey folder on the desk. "This morning I reviewed Mareuil's manuscript, or what's left of it. Would you like to see anything interesting?" He carefully opened the folder and removed page 118. This sheet was missing. But it wasn't torn out. It was removed and hidden. And look here, in the corner. Bernet paled slightly. "That doesn't mean anything. It could have been written by anyone." "No, sir. The initials match your signature on multiple club documents. You accidentally signed your own." Bernet ran a hand over his forehead. "I didn't kill her." Poirot didn't blink. "But you edited the manuscript." Silence. "That's what I do," Bernet finally said. "I revise, I correct, I delete. Audrey asked me for my opinion on the entire manuscript, including that page. I took it to her. She read it. She looked at me as if I'd spit on her grave. She said publishing it would betray everything this club stood for. She threatened to withdraw her support. To me, it felt like a death sentence." Poirot listened to him in silence, his hands clasped around the walking stick he didn't need but used as an anchor. "So you decided to eliminate the threat?" "No. I just took the page down. I wanted to protect her, protect myself. I didn't think she—" He swallowed. "That she could die. I swear when I saw her, she was already dead." Poirot stood up. "Perhaps you are telling the truth, Monsieur Bernet, or part of it. But now everything changes." Poirot returned to the reading room and asked for the three suspects to reconvene. Sibylle Fournier arrived with a tense expression, Albin Mareuil with his usual cynicism, and Bernet with a pallor he no longer tried to hide. Poirot stood by the extinguished fireplace. This time he had no questions. He had statements. "My friends, Madame Vallon wasn't killed randomly. She was eliminated because she possessed something more powerful than control of the committee, knowledge. She had read something that shouldn't survive." Nobody spoke. The Mareuil manuscript, the final confession, wasn't just literature, it was a mirror. It reflected with brutal precision the dynamics of power, betrayal, and manipulation that corrode this club, and someone, fearing that reflection, tried to silence it. Poirot turned to Bernet. "You deleted the key page. Not out of hatred, but out of desperation. But that didn't save her. Because when Audrey received that page, she didn't back down. She prepared herself." He then took the crumpled note from the victim's coat. "If something happens to me, the ending is not fiction." Poirot paused. He let the weight of the sentence permeate the room. "This isn't a suicide note. It's a warning." The three remained motionless, but only one avoided his gaze. Poirot then pointed his cane at Mareuil. "You wrote the crime, but the manuscript you submitted to the club didn't have page 118. However, Audrey had it. How so?" "It wasn't me," Mareuil said. "My copy ended on page 117. Someone added that page later." "Exactly," said Poirot. "And that person was the one who wanted the crime to happen according to a script. Not one that Mareuil wrote, but one that someone else had written. Rewrote." He then turned slowly towards Sibylle. "Mademoiselle, You were the only one who read the entire manuscript with Audrey, the only one who knew both its contents and the victim's reaction, the only one who wrote daily in black ink, in an antique fountain pen, the cartridge of which is now missing. Sibylle looked down. The silence that followed was abysmal. Poirot, without raising his voice, concluded, "You didn't mean to kill her. You wanted her to understand the pain she caused, but in the end, your rage wrote another page, one that was no longer a poem, but a sentence." The tension snapped like a string stretched to its limit. Sibylle burst into tears. She didn't fight back. She just murmured, She said my words didn't hurt, that they weren't true. I wanted them to be. Poirot approached. He offered him his handkerchief, not the one he had found at the scene, but a clean, white one without initials. Innocent. Sometimes, mademoiselle, words kill more than poison. But when the two are combined, then yes, we have a perfect literary crime. Chapter 6. The Judgment of Mirrors. Lyon dawned with a sky that seemed painted in a palette of indecisive greys. The first light glided over the wet rooftops, but inside the Club Les Belles Lettres, clarity had not yet arrived. Sibylle Fournier's half-confession the night before had shaken the board, but Poirot knew there were still pieces missing, and in crimes where literary ego was involved, the first confession was rarely the truest. Inspector Girard had ordered Sibylle confined to a side room while the details were processed. She wasn't formally arrested, but her situation hung by an invisible thread woven with ink, poison, and pain. Poirot, however, was not satisfied. That morning, he asked to be alone in the club's portrait room, a long gallery hung with oil paintings of the founders, former presidents, and distinguished members. The faces of all those guardians of the printed word stared at him from the walls, eternally motionless, as if they were judges in a trial that never ended. In front of the portrait of Audrey Vallon, Poirot stopped. Not out of nostalgia, but because there, on the lower frame, just behind the small nameplate, was an imperfection, a tiny, almost invisible chip, as if someone had inserted something. Poirot carefully slid his fingernail in and removed a small piece of paper, folded with pinpoint precision. He opened it. It was a paragraph, unsigned, undated. The perfect crime is not committed in action, but in omission. Ink doesn't kill, but it doesn't warn either. The true guilt lies with those who permit the crime, even if they don't carry it out. Poirot held it in his gloved hand. This wasn't a confession. It was a veiled accusation, a reflection from the abyss. And from the typeface, from the elegant strokes, he knew immediately who had written it. No Sibylle, no Bernet. Albin Mareuil. Later, in the club's small inner garden, where a fountain trickled with a funereal rhythm, Poirot found Mareuil reading with calculated calm. He was wearing the same dark coat as always, and a scarf that now seemed part of his skin. "Monsieur Mareuil," said Poirot in a gentle voice, "I have found something of yours." He handed him the fragment. Mareuil read it. He didn't deny his authorship. "I wrote it for Audrey, or maybe for myself. It wasn't a threat. It was a side note. A note that suggests you knew something was going to happen." Mareuil closed the book without marking the page. "I knew Sibylle was on edge. I didn't need to be a detective to see it, but I didn't incite her. I just observed her, like I observe everything, and like she observed me when I wrote about her." Poirot sat down next to him. "That's precisely what worries me, monsieur. You're a writer, yes, but also a provocateur. Every word of yours was intended to ignite something. Didn't you know you were striking a match on ground soaked in resentment? Mareuil did not reply immediately. And isn't that the function of art? He said finally, to expose what everyone denies. Audrey built an empire on humiliation disguised as criticism. I only held up the mirror. I didn't push it toward her. Poirot nodded slowly. So you didn't kill with poison, but with omission. But there's something else. He took a photostatic copy of page 118 from his pocket, now filed as evidence. Poirot pointed to an underlined word, she. In your original manuscript, the female figure in the crime didn't have a name, but here it does. You deliberately dropped the word she. Not a character, but a person. Audrey. Mareuil looked at him with a grave expression. I didn't think I'd read it to the end. But she did, and you knew it. You were the only one who knew that page would return to her hands because you yourself left it where she couldn't bear to read it. The crime, monsieur, wasn't the poison. It was the idea. Later, Poirot met with Girard again and asked to speak to Sibylle once more, this time not to question her but to release a burden she herself did not understand she was carrying. He found her sitting, head down, caressing the cover of her notebook with her fingertips. Mademoiselle, Poirot began, you didn't kill Audrey Vallon. She looked up, confused. But the poison, it was put in the cup by someone else. You handed over the manuscript, yes. You added a page, perhaps out of anger, but it was a symbolic addition. You didn't have access to the poison, nor to the office where Audrey was found. However, there was someone who did. Someone who watched your every move, who edited your rage as if it were just another manuscript. Sibylle covered her mouth with her hand. Vernet, he whispered. Poirot nodded gravely. Etienne Vernet wanted you to look guilty. He wanted the manuscript to be your downfall. He added the poison. You only added ink. That same afternoon, Girard stopped Vernet, who was trying to leave the city by train, carrying his usual suitcase, and a small bottle of black ink, carefully hidden in a jar. Digitalis, still with active residue. He confessed halfway, not out of guilt, but because, like a bad editor, he had forgotten to erase his marginalia. Hours later, when the club had once again become feignedly calm, Poirot allowed himself one last conversation with Sibylle. Mademoiselle, what you've written isn't a crime. It's an inconvenient truth, and perhaps one day it will be a great work. She looked at him, tears shed. And how do you know? Poirot smiled slightly. Because only the innocent write with their hearts, the guilty write with calculation. He bowed, kissed her hand politely, and walked away without looking back, as if he knew with absolute certainty that the story had already reached its final point. Chapter 7. A Death in First Person. The rain returned to Lyon that night, as if the sky had taken a break just so the truth could come out. Under the slippery roofs of the Club Les Belles Lettres, everything seemed to be back in its place. The reading room was reopened, the fireplace was lit again, and the porcelain cups finally served tea that held no secrets. But there was still a feeling in the air that something wasn't quite right, as if the solution had come too soon, or too elegantly. Hercule Poirot, however, did not rest. Although Etienne Vernet had been arrested and his partial confession was enough to close the case in the eyes of the police, Poirot felt the unmistakable weight of an unfinished story. And for a man who had dedicated his life to unraveling human plots, half-truths were worse than the crime itself. That morning, Poirot didn't stay at his usual hotel. Instead, he requested access to Audrey Vallon's personal files once again. At that hour, only the night watchman accompanied him, sleepy and incurious. Poirot locked himself in the office, turned on the desk lamp and settled down to read. Not the manuscript, not the police reports, but the deceased's personal diary, found in a false bottom of the first drawer, bound in red leather, untitled, just one word embroidered on the back cover, "End." The diary wasn't long. The last pages were devastatingly clear. I reread Mareuil's manuscript. The copy Sibylle gave me was incomplete, but I found among her papers the final page. It's not hers. I know this because I was the one who taught Sibylle how to construct a first-person voice that didn't confess, but revealed. I recognized it instantly. She wrote that page, not for the world, for me, to hurt me. Poirot closed his eyes. Sibylle had lied. Maybe not about everything, but about the authorship of page 118. It wasn't Bernay who added it. It was her. And if that page had the power to destroy Audrey, then it could also unleash the will to kill in whoever read it. Poirot continued reading. I fear for myself, but even more so for her. She's crossed a line. And Mareuil. Oh, Mareuil watches like someone who wants to see blood, but not get his hands on it. If anything happens to me, I want someone to read these words. They'll know. He, Poirot. At dawn, Poirot left the office, newspaper in hand. He walked toward the conservatory, where dew was beginning to condense on the windows. There was Mareuil, awake as always, surrounded by dry leaves that were not literature. Monsieur Mareuil, Poirot said wearily, I have read Audrey, her last pages, her true ones. Mareuil looked at him without surprise. So you know, I always knew you would. It's inevitable. What is inevitable, monsieur? That Audrey's death was not the work of a single hand. Poirot sat opposite him, this time lacking his usual composure. He wasn't the brilliant detective. He was the weary reader faced with a story he didn't want to finish. Sibylle didn't poison the cup. Bernay did. But she was the one who wrote the page that started it all. You read it. And it didn't stop anything. I am neither judge nor executioner, Monsieur Poirot. I only write. Number you design. You push, you suggest, and then you watch the world execute your ideas. Mareuil looked at him with unexpected sadness. Do you know what Audrey told me the last time we spoke? That my books were good, but never essential. That my pen could wound, but not transform. That my language was inconsequential. And you set out to prove the opposite. Mareuil smiled, barely. I didn't kill, but I wanted others to do it. Is that a crime, Monsieur Poirot? Perhaps not before the law, Poirot said quietly, but before conscience. There was a long silence, only the faint sound of the fountain behind the glass. What will you do with this? Poirot stood up slowly. I'll do what an honest writer does. I won't change the ending, but I'll read it through. Without omitting the fault the reader prefers to ignore. Later that day, Sibylle was released, but she left the club of her own accord. Her notebook was left behind, forgotten on a marble table, filled with unfinished verses. Bernay faced trial, convicted of manslaughter. His confession saved him from a heavier sentence, but not from eternal discredit in literary circles. And Alban Mareuil, the man who poisoned no one but gave everyone the words to justify death, published a new book 6 months later. It was titled First Person. Critics hailed it for its rawness, its psychological depth, and its ambiguous sense of crime. No one knew that the last page had been written by someone else. Nobody except Poirot. That night, on the way back to Paris, Poirot looked out the train window. The lights of Lyon were receding like words one dares not reread. In his personal notebook, he wrote a single sentence. Sometimes the killer doesn't wield a knife or pour poison. He just delivers an idea and lets the world accept it. Chapter 8. The Immortal Manuscript. In the days following his departure from Lyon, Hercule Poirot took on no new cases. He rejected invitations, declined private consultations, and even postponed his usual reading of his morning newspaper. The official resolution of the crime at the Club Les Belles Lettres had not silenced his mind. On the contrary, something in the texture of the case, a torn page, a half-confession, a manuscript redesigned from the shadows, remained latent. Like an incomplete melody, the echo of the crime did not fade. One cloudy afternoon in Paris, while sorting his papers in his study on the Rue des Martyrs, Poirot received a package with no return address. It was discreet, wrapped in cream-colored paper and tied with fine string, as if it had been packaged not by nervous, but by ceremonial hands. Inside lay an edition of the final confession, an edition that, according to all editorial logic, should not exist. The manuscript, until that moment, had never been published. Mareuil had claimed not to have submitted it to any publisher after the scandal, and yet there it was, printed on high-quality paper with a sober typography, accompanied by an unsigned prologue. Poirot sat down, opened the book with thin gloves, and began to read. He immediately recognized the original passages, Mareuil's rhythm, the intentional time jumps, the bone-dry metaphors. But he also saw something else, a delicate interference, imperceptible to anyone not looking for the invisible, modified paragraphs, softened passages, and above all, a completely different final chapter. The famous page 118, missing from all previous versions, was here. But it wasn't the one he'd recovered. It was a fusion, part Mareuil's style, part Sibylle's confessional tone, and an invisible hand uniting them like a perfectly woven emotional collage. Poirot moved on to the prologue. He didn't have a name, but his voice was unmistakable. This book wasn't written by just one person. It was born of desire, humiliation, silence, and guilt. It's not meant to redeem, but to record. Crime sometimes doesn't require weapons, just words. And this manuscript isn't forgotten because it never ends. As long as someone reads it, its crime continues. Poirot closed the book and remained silent for several minutes. Then he stood up, went to his desk, and took out an envelope he had kept since his return. It was a letter Audrey Vallon had never sent, found in the folds of his coat, with no addressee written on it. He read it again, now in a new light. There are those who write to be remembered, and those who write so they don't disappear themselves. But there is a more dangerous class, those who write so that others may burn. The true author of this story will never sign his name, but you will recognize him by the way others repeat his crime. That same week, Poirot returned to Lyon discreetly. He did not notify the police or the club. He visited a small bookshop in the Quartier Saint-Jean, where, according to his investigations, the first 10 copies of The Final Confession, the bookseller, a young man with horn-rimmed glasses and a Provençal accent, recalled having received the order through an intermediary with no clear identification. It was a special request. Everything was very formal, very meticulous. He didn't seem like an author seeking fame, more like someone closing a circle. Poirot asked if he had any remaining copies. The bookseller shook his head. They flew. People worship forbidden things. Poirot walked slowly along the shelves. He found signed editions of Sibylle Fournier, poems that still retained the uncertainty of a beginner. Beside them, novels by Mareuil, those from before the scandal, with impassive dedications. But what caught his eye most was a small card hanging from a string next to the cash register. In handwriting it read, "Stories don't die, they just change authors." Later, Poirot sat alone in a cafe overlooking the Rhône. The city was alive around him, but he stared off into the distance, as if hoping the story he had just read might still have a different ending. It was then that he noticed the figure sitting on the other side of the terrace, Sibylle Fournier. She was dressed discreetly, without makeup, with an open notebook in front of her, although she wasn't writing. Their eyes met. She didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, she nodded slightly, like someone who already knows she's been caught but has nothing more to hide. Poirot approached slowly. "Mademoiselle," he said, sitting down without asking permission. "Who published the manuscript?" Sibylle didn't respond immediately. Then, in a calm voice, she said, "He wrote it. I completed it, but it was Audrey who inspired it. I thought it should be published, not for justice, for memory." "And the edition?" "An independent publishing house in Brussels. I used pseudonyms. I wasn't aiming for fame, just that the crime wouldn't disappear under the police's story." Poirot sighed. "And now what will you do?" She slowly closed the notebook. "Keep writing, but not about others anymore. About myself." For the first time. Poirot stood up. Before leaving, he looked at her one last time. "Then make sure, mademoiselle, that this time your words are not a weapon." That night, in his hotel room, Poirot wrote a final note in his personal notebook. In the end, the culprit wasn't Bernet, nor Sibylle, nor Mareuil. The real culprit was the manuscript, a living creature of ink and trauma, written by many, signed by no one. An immortal confession that kills with every reading. Then he closed the notebook, turned off the light, and allowed himself for the first time since the case began to sleep without suspicion. Chapter 9. The Club That Wrote Its Own Death. The rain in Lyon didn't stop. It was a fine, persistent rain, the kind that doesn't wet furiously but soaks to the bone, like the kind of truth that doesn't scream, but insinuates itself until it becomes inescapable. Poirot, back in the city for the second time, walked slowly through the narrow streets of the old quarter, heading for a meeting he himself had called. A final visit to the club Les Belles Lettres, not to interrogate, but to testify. Because what remained unsolved wasn't a crime, but its consequence. The silence shared by those who allowed it. The committee, now reduced to a few formal figures, welcomed him into the central library. The atmosphere was different. There was no tea, no social gathering, just tense faces, most of them aware that the club would never be what it once was. Sibylle Fournier wasn't present by her own choice. Mareuil, however, was. Standing by an open window, he smoked with the theatricality of an author who knows that his reputation lives as much on what he says as on what he doesn't. Poirot stood before them, his hands crossed on his chest and his moustache neatly arranged. No one spoke. No one dared to fill the silence with banalities. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began gently, "I'm here not as a detective, but as a reader. I've read all your texts. I've even read the ones that weren't meant to be published. And in doing so, I've understood something that goes beyond Madame Vallon's murder." He looked towards the shelf where the private edition of the final confession, now enclosed behind glass, as if it were a poisonous relic. The crime committed within these walls didn't begin with poison, nor did it end with a confession. It went much deeper. It was a crime of culture, of hierarchy, of language. Their faces hardened. Some lowered their gaze. For years, Poirot continued, this club elevated some and silenced others. It disguised cruelty with propriety, exclusion with erudition, and envy with literary criticism. No one killed Audrey Vallon alone. All of you pushed her a little closer to the edge. One of the members, Mrs. Lucille Delaunay, raised her voice. Are you suggesting that the responsibility for the crime is collective? Poirot looked at her gently. No, madame. I'm not insinuating. I'm affirming. Not everyone poured the poison into the cup, but many contributed to the poison in their souls. And when an environment becomes a stage where ego is more important than truth, death, sooner or later, arrives as an inevitable climax. A murmur ran through the room, not of disagreement, but of discomfort, as if those words touched on areas that literature never dares to put on paper. Poirot took a step towards the central table, where the club's rules lay bound in old leather. Here is your dogma. Rule after rule about who deserves to be heard, who has a voice and who doesn't. Madame Vallon used it as a shield, Bernet as a sword, Mareuil as a mirror, and Sibylle was the reflection you chose not to see. Mareuil stubbed out his cigarette on the windowsill. He said nothing. He just watched. Poirot sighed with a hint of compassion. Literature should be humanity's refuge, not its executioner. And yet you have built a house of mirrors where every word can be a knife. He then turned to the portrait of Audrey Vallon hanging above the fireplace. The woman still seemed to be regarding them with that look of unwavering judgment. She was both victim and executioner. The crime killed her, yes, but it was written by everyone, page by page, verse by verse. There was a long silence. No one knew whether to applaud, respond, or simply accept. That evening, Poirot walked alone through the wet city streets, his umbrella twirling slightly in the wind. He stopped in front of the club's entrance, the interior light having been completely extinguished. For the first time in decades, the Club Les Belles Lettres was closed for mourning. But Poirot knew that it was not mourning for Audrey Vallon that hung in the air. It was mourning for the idea of the club, for what it had intended to be, for what it never was. Returning to his hotel, Poirot opened his notebook. His fingers hesitated for a moment. Then he wrote, "Not all crimes end with an arrest. Some end with reflection. And in those cases, justice is not dispensed by a judge, but by the reader." He closed the notebook slowly. He looked at the copy of the final confession on the table. He hadn't put it back yet. He wasn't sure he could, because some books, he realized then, are not returned. They are carried. They are inherited. And sometimes they are afraid. Chapter 10. The Last Reviewer. The next morning, the sky over Lyon dawned clear for the first time in days. The rooftops still glistened with the memory of the rain, but the air was crisp, as if even the weather had decided to turn the page. Poirot, however, hadn't. His train back to Paris left that afternoon, but his instinct told him to make one last stop. Not out of necessity, out of justice, out of balance, out of closure. The taxi dropped him off in front of a modest house on the outskirts of the St. Paul neighborhood. It had limestone walls and an overgrown garden, but there was something about it that suggested seclusion. A cottage of unspoken words. There lived a figure who had not yet appeared on the scene, but whose shadow loomed on every page of the case, the last official reader of the Les Belles Lettres Club. An old man named Clément Arnaud, retired for years, but still named in the archives a honorary reader for life. No one had mentioned it, not even Audrey. And yet, Poirot had found notes from her in the margins of the original manuscript. The time had come to meet the last inspector. Clément Arnaud opened the door with resigned slowness. His face was furrowed with wrinkles as deep as the lines in a forgotten novel, and his eyes were the colour of the dust that settles on unopened books. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without surprise, "I expected you." "Oh, yes? And how is that possible?" "Because I knew you would look for what no one wanted to read." She let him in without question. The interior was a temple to paper, stacks of books on the stairs, hand-bound manuscripts, literary magazines from bygone eras piled next to an Olivetti typewriter covered by a handkerchief. The air smelled of cold coffee, aged paper, and something else, intellectual disappointment. Poirot sat down cautiously, pushing aside some volumes of Racine and Colette. "Monsieur Arnaud," he began, "I need to know what role you played in the manuscript. Your name isn't officially listed, but your handwriting is in the margins." Arnaud nodded slowly. "Audrey brought it to me weeks before she died. She asked me to read it. The final confession, and to tell him whether it should be published. Not whether it was good, not whether it was brave, but whether it should exist. That was his word. Exist. And what did he answer? I told him no." Poirot looked at him carefully. "Because?" "Because it wasn't a novel. It was a reckoning, an aesthetic and moral act of war between a wounded author, a disheartened young woman, and an aging critic, and between the lines. There was something else, a desire to wound each other using the only tool they shared, writing." Poirot nodded. The portrait was accurate. "And what did she do with her answer?" He laughed, and he said to me, "So that's exactly why it exists, because it hurts." Arnaud stood up with difficulty, went to a low shelf, and took out a notebook with the dark blue cover. He handed it to Poirot with trembling hands. "Here are my notes, some about style, some about content, and one at the end that I never showed to Audrey." Poirot leafed through the notebook. There they were, cold, fair, precise observations, comments on the narrative rhythm, the excessive metaphors, the changes in voice. But the last note, on the back cover, read, "This manuscript cannot be edited. It can be censored or left intact, but never corrected, because by correcting it, one takes sides." Poirot slowly closed the notebook. "So, Monsieur Arnaud, do you think the manuscript killed Audrey?" The old man looked at him with tired eyes. "Number. But it did open the door. Literature, Monsieur Poirot, doesn't kill. But it can push someone who's already on the brink." Poirot remained silent. Once again, he was faced with what he feared most, the truth that didn't fit into any police report. Before saying goodbye, Poirot asked one last question. "And do you think someone else read your notes?" Arnaud shook his head. "Only you. You're the only reader who wanted to understand the whole story, not just the crime." Poirot bowed slightly. "Thank you. And I promise your final grade won't be ignored." On his way back to the centre of Lyon, Poirot stopped one last time at the Club Les Belles Lettres. The front door was closed, but an unstamped envelope was sticking out of the mailbox. He took it. Its name was written in a handwriting he already knew, Mareuse. Inside was a single typewritten sheet of paper. "I've corrected many stories, Poirot. This is the first one you've corrected for me. I won't write again for a while, or perhaps ever. Not out of guilt, out of respect. You were the only reader this manuscript deserved. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be." Already on the train to Paris, Poirot watched the landscape passing through the glass. He thought of Audrey Vallon, Sibylle, Mareuil, Bernay, of Arnaud, the man who refused to intervene. They had all written part of a story that had no single author or innocent reader. He took out his notebook and, like someone putting the final period in a dangerous novel, wrote, "The crime was committed between the lines." Not on one page, but on every page. Not by one, but by all those who believed that correcting a life was less serious than interrupting it. And then finally, he closed the notebook, and he let the story end. Chapter 11. The Epilogue That Was Not Written. When Poirot arrived in Paris that evening, he didn't go to his usual apartment on the Rue des Martyrs. Instead, he went straight to a small private reading room in the Sainte-Geneviève library, where a special copy of the Les Belles Lettres Club archive, which he had requested during his last day in Lyon, was waiting for him. It wasn't a manuscript this time. It was a series of letters, internal committee minutes, and a barely known record, the Book of the Rejected. The book where the authors rejected by the club since its founding were recorded. Poirot settled into a secluded corner. The room was silent, with only an antique clock ticking away, as if each second were a new line in a novel he didn't want to finish. He spent the first few hours reviewing names, pseudonyms, titles, terse rejection comments, too theatrical, still immature voice, lack of moral elegance. And suddenly, on page 43 of the volume, an entry from 5 years ago, Fournier, S., reversed hours, observation, potential but emotionally unstable, needs distance from his subjects, rejected unanimously. Poirot leaned his back against the backrest. That was the first cut, the beginning of the rift. Not yet a crime, but the silent wound that would later fuel a crime by proxy. The club had rejected Sibylle before she knew who she was, not just her work, but her identity. He continued reading. The writing on the record changed over the years, but a pattern emerged. An alarming number of young women were rejected with patronizing formulas. Many men were accepted with promising style, even when their work was disorganized or still rudimentary. Poirot closed the book. Not with anger, with sadness. Because what had begun as a criminal investigation was now revealed to be something deeper, the story of an institution that, under the guise of literary merit, had for decades applied a silent hierarchy, where aesthetics and prestige were shields that justified contempt. That evening, back at his apartment, Poirot received an unexpected call. It was Mareuil. "I don't want to talk about the book," he said instantly. "I just need to tell you one thing before you close this case in your head." Poirot listened in silence. "Audrey knew she was going to die," Mareuil continued. "Not the how or the when, but the inevitability. She had crossed too many boundaries with too many people. She knew it. That's why she handed me an envelope a week before. She asked me to read it only after her death. I never did, but I think you should have it." The next morning, a messenger left the envelope at Poirot's door. The detective examined it. Thick paper, red sealing wax, no return address. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in Audrey Vallon's own hand. "Mr. Poirot, if you ever read this, it means I'm no longer here. I'm not saddened by my death, but by its cause. I've played with the words of others as if they were chess pieces, without realizing that each sentence leaves a scar. I always thought that by correcting, I improved. But now I fear I've amputated. Mareuil's manuscript didn't pain me because it was cruel, but because it was exact. It wasn't its judgment I feared. It was its mirror. Of all the characters I've edited, Sibylle was the only one who could still write herself. I didn't know how to let her blossom. And so, if something happens, don't blame the one who poured the poison. Blame the one who taught you to see the world as an ink weapon. Poirot left the letter on the table. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. Paris was still there, its streets gleaming in the morning light, as if unaware that a few hours to the south, a woman had left her own epilogue, unedited by anyone. That afternoon, Poirot wrote the last entry in his research notebook. There is no lone killer when crime stems from a structure, and there is no true justice when culture decides who is allowed to write the truth. This story doesn't end with a confession. It ends with a collective silence. Days later, a new newsletter from the Les Belles Lettres Club announced profound changes to its structure, opening up membership, revising its editorial criteria, and eliminating the sole selection committee. For the first time, a workshop program led by young, previously unpublished authors would be launched. The program would bear the name of Audrey Vallon. No one protested. Some saw it as a tribute, others as redemption. But for Poirot, it was something else, an attempt, not to erase the crime, but to stop it from being repeated. In his office, Poirot closed the notebook, tied the ribbon firmly, and placed it on his personal shelf, right between two special volumes, The 10 Little Murders and the Murder of Roger Ackroyd. He looked at him for a few seconds. Then he lowered his head, and in a barely audible whisper, he murmured, "End. Chapter 12. A last reading for Poirot." A week had passed since Hercule Poirot closed his notebook with the word "end," but his mind, as orderly as his moustache and as meticulous as his personal filing system, couldn't consider. The case truly over, because some stories, even when solved, continue to be written in the conscience, not because of what they revealed, but because of what they exposed about those who write them, and those who read them. One Sunday afternoon, while reorganizing his personal files, as he often did when he wanted to clear his mind, Poirot discovered a letter he didn't remember reading. It was in a folder labeled in his handwriting, "Unresolved Correspondence, LBL Club." The envelope was old, with worn corners, and had no return address. The postmark was faded, but the handwriting was recognizable. It was from Sibylle Fournier. He opened it carefully. "Mr. Poirot, maybe you'll never read this letter, or maybe you'll do so after it's all over. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm writing it, because I don't want my story to be completely at the mercy of others, not even you. Audrey taught me to read, not in the academic sense, but to read like someone dissecting a corpse, looking for what's wrong inside. That made me strong, and it also made me fragile, because when you look too long at someone else's fragility, you begin to hate your own. You saw the innocent side of me, and I wasn't lying when I said I didn't use the poison, but I was lying when I said I didn't want her to die. I did, just not with my hands, but with my words. I didn't kill her physically, but I hurt her in a way no one wanted to see." Poirot stopped at that point. He took a breath. He reread the last sentence. Then he continued, "Perhaps you will forgive me, or perhaps not. I don't know if I forgive myself either. I only know that after writing that page, the one you found and Bernay used, I felt something I'd never felt before. Power. A dangerous power that scared me and pleased me at the same time. I handed it over like someone hands over a gun without knowing if it's loaded. Bernay fired, but the bullet already had my name on it. Mareuil. He knew. He didn't defend me, but he didn't betray me either. We used each other. And I offered him that page, like one offers an open wound. He read it, but he didn't correct it. Now I know, the crime wasn't committed by just one person. It was collective. But it was also intimate. It was mine, a crime of language. And you, sir, have been its most sincere reader. Thank you for reading my entire story. He signed with an initial S. Poirot closed his eyes. The letter didn't change the facts. Bernet remained the material perpetrator of the crime, Mareuil, the aesthetic manipulator, Sibylle, the emotional perpetrator. But that letter, written not to absolve, but to reveal, transformed the conclusion. There was something profoundly literary about it all. The scene, the poison, the manuscript, the silences. And now, this final letter. As if the entire case hadn't been an investigation, but a novel written by multiple authors, one of whom had just added the missing epilogue. That evening, Poirot attended an intimate event at the National Library, a silent reading in memory of Audrey Vallon. There were no speeches, no empty tributes. Only a book was opened, Letters to Intransigence, and the audience was left to read alone in silence in the white marble room. Mareuil was present, sitting at the back, alone, not looking anyone's way, not writing. Sibylle didn't attend, but someone had left a dried flower between the pages of the book on display, an iris. The flower Audrey used as a symbolic signature in the margins of the manuscripts she enthusiastically approved. Poirot approached. He touched it barely. Then, without anyone seeing, he slipped Sibylle's letter between the last pages of the book, not as evidence, not as an accusation, but as the last, unpublished chapter. Later, walking through the quiet streets of Paris, Poirot pondered the case. Throughout his career, he had solved crimes of passion, finance, and impulsiveness. But this one was different. This had been a crime of style, a murder where the ink was more lethal than the intention, a literary crime that could only be understood from within the page. Passing by a bookstore at night, Poirot stopped in front of the window. Among the new items, he saw something that made him frown, the Final Confession, 2nd edition. This time it had two signatures, A. Mareuil and S. Fournier. He didn't say anything. He didn't come in. He kept walking, because he knew with absolute certainty that true crimes need not be repeated. They just need to be read by enough people. Back home, he turned on his lamp, took out his grey cloth notebook, and wrote his last note on the case. A murder can be solved, but a story doesn't stop. It lives on in those who repeat it, interpret it, hide it, or rewrite it. In this case, justice wasn't blind. It was a reader. And the punishment wasn't prison, but permanence. All the guilty parties have been condemned to be remembered. Poirot closed the notebook. He turned off the light, and in the darkness, for the first time, he allowed the silence to read him. Chapter 13. The Broken Mirror of Motive. Night had fallen over Villers-les-Mouettes with an almost artificial calm, as if the crime itself refused to breathe. The clouds gathered over the sea, and the trees, motionless, seemed to hold their breath. In the library's private study, Poirot sat by the unlit fireplace, surrounded by documents, letters, photographs, and an underlined copy of the manuscript that Émile Grandjean was never able to finish. Beside her, Miss Judith Delmire sat stiffly, playing with a handkerchief in her lap. Her fingers, white and tense, kept twisting. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently without looking at her, "do you know what an author fears most when writing his memoirs?" Judith looked at him, confused. "Oblivion?" Poirot shook his head slightly. "The mistake. the detail that contradicts your own version of events, because an author who lies about their past runs the risk of leaving a truth visible between the lines. Judith looked down. I don't understand why you're telling me this. Don't be alarmed. I'm not accusing you, I'm just having a conversation. Poirot stood up and began to pace slowly across the carpet, his hands clasped behind his back. In this case, mademoiselle, there is a truth that has been carefully veiled by pride and pain. And yet, some truths always seek to come to light, like ink blots in the sun. Judith pressed her lips together. Something in her expression changed. It was no longer fear, but sadness. Did you find anything else in the manuscript? Oui? Something that isn't in it? Poirot held up a yellowish envelope. A letter addressed to my most silent confidant. The envelope was hidden in the false bottom of the manuscript box. Signed Émile Grandjean, not sent. Dated 2 days before his death. Judith sat up in surprise. And what does it say? He speaks of a betrayal. He doesn't name it, but describes it as the greatest pain of my life and yet the hardest to condemn. He speaks of someone he had secretly forgiven but whose closeness he found unbearable. Judith swallowed. Do you think he was talking about me? Poirot didn't reply. He just sat back down and crossed one leg over the other. Can I tell you something, mademoiselle? Something that puzzled me from the start. Judith nodded, her voice low. Of course. During dinner the night before the crime, Émile served wine, right? Everyone drank it except him. Yes, I had a migraine. I always had that when I wrote for a long time. However, the ink bottle on his desk contained traces of the same wine. Judith opened her eyes. What do you mean? That someone mixed wine with ink. A distraction, perhaps. A way to alter a manuscript, or to disguise a change in the handwriting. Poirot held up a document. I found 2 rewritten pages, same content, different handwriting, done by someone who tried to imitate his handwriting, but didn't quite succeed. Judith jumped up. That's absurd. Who would do something like that? Poirot looked at her for a long time. That's what I hope to find out. But I assure you one thing, mademoiselle. Ink doesn't lie, and neither does motive. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Beaulieu, the housekeeper, entered, her face worried. Monsieur Poirot, excuse the intrusion, but a package has arrived for you. Anonymous. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Anonymous? No return address. It just says, for those who know how to read between the lines. Poirot took it carefully. It was a simple wooden box, sealed with a string. When he opened it, he found an unexpected object. An antique hand mirror, its glass broken. Judith watched him uneasily. What does that mean? Poirot leaned over the mirror. The frame bore a carved inscription. Don't just see what's reflected. Look also at what's missing. For several seconds the detective said nothing. Then, with a flash of understanding, his eyes lit up. Ah. Finally the mirror has broken at the right angle. Judith looked at him, puzzled. What angle? Poirot left the mirror on the table. The angle of truth, mademoiselle. When a mirror breaks, it reveals not one, but many truths. Each fragment a different perspective. The same goes for witnesses and suspects. Judith took a step back. Are you going to meet us again? Yes. This time will be the last. I don't need any more interviews. Just silence. And a confession that's about to be born. Poirot approached the window. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks with increasing force. The sea had changed its face. The calm was over. Call everyone, Mademoiselle Delmar. Tonight, the crime will be read. as if it were a novel, and I will be its last reader. Chapter 14. The Art of Listening to the Silent Culprits. The music room at Villa-les-Mouettes had been arranged with almost theatrical precision. The chairs were lined up in a semicircle, as if waiting for a performance to begin. In the center, like a veteran actor who already knows the ending, Hercule Poirot waited silently. The light from 2 low lamps cast long shadows on the walls, and the curtains were closed, as if the sea itself weren't allowed to peer into what was about to happen. One by one, the inhabitants of the house entered. Gérard Grandjean did it first, with a forced elegance that barely concealed his impatience. He sat with his arms crossed, casting an irritated glance at the grandfather clock. Then Marianne Lefort, the literary agent, arrived, wearing her linen jacket and holding a notebook, as if she were hoping to jot down some revelation she could turn into a publishing contract. She walked quickly, not looking at anyone. Alain Montfort, the Parisian editor, followed him, visibly nervous, his shoulders slumped and his eyes shifty. He sat at the back, trying to go unnoticed, which was impossible when Poirot was in the room. Finally, Judith Delmar entered with soft, almost inaudible steps. Her face was serene, but her hands, as always, betrayed her restlessness. She sat down by the window, her back to the broken mirror Poirot had placed on the mahogany table. The Belgian detective remained silent for a few seconds. When he spoke, he did so with a calmness that chilled the blood of those present. "My friends, tonight I won't ask questions. They're no longer necessary. What I want is for you to listen." Those present looked at each other with suspicion. I've studied every word of Émile Grandjean's manuscript, every silence between paragraphs, every torn page, and every repeated stroke. But more than reading with my eyes, I've read with the ear of my soul, because, as I told you, what's left unsaid sometimes screams. He paused for a moment, walking slowly in front of them. This crime isn't modern. It didn't happen 3 days ago. It began long before that. It was sown in the soil of resentment, watered with secrets, and finally reaped with a feather. Marianne frowned. "Are you implying that it was planned years ago?" Poirot smiled politely. "I'm implying that it was inevitable." He turned to the mirror. "This mirror, mes amis, was sent to me with an inscription. Don't see only what is reflected, see also what is missing. And what's missing in this case is a story." Judith looked up. "A story?" "Oui, the story that wasn't told, the story that had to be erased from the manuscript, not with fire, not with scissors, but with falsehood." He walked over to a folder on the table and took out 2 pages. He placed them side by side. Here they are. 2 versions of the same passage, one written from the heart, the other from fear. Everyone leaned forward to look. The differences were subtle: a missing comma, a swapped word, a more ambiguous turn of phrase. But to Poirot, they were the cries of a troubled conscience. Émile wrote about an episode from his youth in Arles, a night when a manuscript disappeared, and another appeared, signed by a different pen. It was the beginning of his fame, but also of his captivity, because the person who stole that story, who signed it in Émile's place, was never charged. On the contrary, they became part of his inner circle. Their faces paled. Gérard shifted in his seat. "Are you saying someone here stole your first manuscript?" Poirot looked up slowly. "I'm saying that someone built their life on a robbery, and that Émile, out of fear, affection, or guilt, allowed the secret to live with him, until he decided to break the pact and write it down." A thick silence fell over the room. "But then," Alain Montfort said in a trembling voice, "why didn't you report that person?" "Because, sir, the culprit was more than a thief. He was also a reflection of his own weakness, and because a writer's revenge isn't written with denunciations, but with words." In the last chapter of the original manuscript, Émile revealed not only the theft, but also the reason for his silence. But those pages have disappeared. Poirot approached Judith. And then someone tried to rewrite them, using wine mixed with ink to imitate Émile's handwriting. But emotion can't be faked, mademoiselle. Nor guilt. Judith didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the broken mirror. "Now you understand," continued Poirot, "why this crime wasn't about money or inheritance or even literary jealousy. It was about fear of discovery. Not about the crime of the present, but about the crime of the past." Marianne raised her voice. "And who, according to you, was capable of that?" Poirot smiled slightly. "I'll save that answer for tomorrow morning, but I assure you one thing, I won't be sleeping tonight, and I know one of you won't be able to either." He turned around, picked up the broken mirror, and held it up to his own face. Because the real murderer no longer sees himself when he looks in the mirror. Poirot walked towards the exit. When he reached the door, he stopped without turning around. "Good night, my friends. See you at dawn." And he disappeared down the hall, leaving behind a room plunged into the most uncomfortable silence, that of thoughts that can no longer be silenced. Chapter 15. Echoes on the page that was never published. Dawn arrived without ceremony. The sky over Normandy was a barely damp canvas of grey, and the murmur of the sea, as constant as the breathing of a dream, seemed to closely observe the movements within the house. In the library, where Émile's manuscript had been desecrated out of fear or despair, Poirot awaited one last test. He had slept barely 2 hours, but his mind, like a Swiss clockwork, showed no signs of fatigue. The table in front of him was covered with neatly arranged copies, the published version of Émile's book, the mutilated version recovered from the fireplace, and fragments that Judith had unexpectedly handed over the night before, saying in a subdued voice, "I couldn't keep them hidden any longer." The fragments were loose pages, unnumbered, but imbued with a voice that could only be Émile Grandjean's, measured, mordant, lucid. They told a fictional story that nonetheless contained an autobiographical wound. A young writer had been betrayed by someone close to him, a friend who stole his manuscript under the pretext of helping him correct it. The friend signed it as his own and, over time, built a career on it. But the young man did not report it. Because, Poirot marked a passage with his pencil, I let him do it. Because in his eyes, I saw a fear deeper than my ambition. And because deep down, I too needed someone to believe that what I had written deserved to exist. He sat up when he heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Inspector Lacombe, with his brisk gait and a notebook under his arm. Good morning, Monsieur Poirot. Dawn seems to bring answers, eh? No, mon ami, Poirot replied without looking up from his manuscript. Dawn brings clarity. Answers come later, if one knows how to listen. Lacombe frowned. Listen to what? Poirot lifted a sheet of paper. The pages, the voices that speak between what's written and what's torn out. You have your notebook, Inspector. Would you mind if we went over it together? Lacombe nodded and sat down. Poirot unfolded the 3 versions of the final chapter of the book. This, he said, pointing to the most damaged one, is the version Judith found among the ashes. Look at the handwriting, the erasures. It's authentic. Émile didn't intend to write literature here. He wanted to tell the truth, even if it's disguised. He then pointed to the version given by Alain Montfort to the publisher. And this is the one that reached the printer. You'll notice the differences. The chapter is cut, the ending is ambiguous, and any hint of betrayal or revenge is gone. Instead, it suggested that the protagonist simply retires from the publishing world out of exhaustion, a white lie, or a conscious forgery. Lacombe quickly took notes. And what makes you think it was Alain who modified it? Poirot shook his head gently. Ah, no, monsieur, don't rush things. Alain certainly had access, but he wasn't the only one. Marianne also had a copy. And Gérard. Well, Gérard knew his father better than anyone, even if he denied it. And then there's Judith, who had the original in her possession, as she admitted last night. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. He stood up and walked over to the window. The garden outside the house was empty. Not a single human figure, just the dew on the flowers and the soft sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. Last night, he continued, I noticed something curious about each of them, not in what they said, but in how they heard it. When I mentioned the theft of a manuscript in Arles, only one of them paled. When I mentioned the mirror, only one avoided looking. And when I spoke of the chapter rewritten with wine and ink, only one shifted his posture, as if he felt the weight of a pen still in his hand. Lacombe watched him with increasing attention. So do you already have the culprit? Poirot turned slowly. I have the perpetrator of the crime, and also the perpetrator of the first robbery. But the tragedy of this story is not that someone killed Émile Grandjean. Non, monsieur. The real tragedy is that for decades everyone here killed parts of him. One stole his voice, another forced him to silence, one manipulated him into silence with elegance, and another, Poirot lowered his voice, loved him too much to let him speak. Lacombe looked down, and what will we do? Poirot closed the manuscripts. Today, I will bring them together once more. I will present the evidence, not to condemn them, not yet, but to see who finally dares to tell the whole story. Lacombe nodded, understanding that they were approaching the climax not of a crime, but of a confession suspended for years. What if no one talks? Poirot smiled bitterly. Then, Inspector, I'll talk. And so, as the sun began to timidly filter through the clouds, Hercule Poirot prepared for what would be his final act at Villa-les-Mouettes. It wasn't yet time to point the finger, but it was time to hold up the mirror and see who couldn't hold their own reflection. Chapter 16. All the characters are in the library. The pendulum clock in the library struck 11 in the morning with a solemn tap, as if sensing the ceremony about to take place. Poirot stood by the window, gazing out at the sea with his hands clasped behind his back. His impassive figure seemed to be part of the antique furniture, as orderly and meticulous as the aligned spines of Émile's books. The door opened with a soft creak. Judith was the first to enter. She was wearing a sober black dress, and her face was ashen. Then came Gérard, the son who had renounced the Grandjean name, his lips pursed and his hands in his pockets. Marianne entered with soft, almost ceremonial steps, and gave a slight nod. Finally, Alain Montfort closed the door behind him without saying a word. His face was a disconcerting mixture of serenity and exhaustion. "Thank you," said Poirot, turning to them. "I thank you for coming. There is something I must say, and you must all hear it, and since it all began with a book, it's only right that we end here." No one responded. Poirot paused, looked around their faces, and in a measured voice continued, "I have reconstructed the last days of Émile Grandjean's life, not with assumptions, but with facts. The night before his death, he received a visit from one of you. That person entered this very library, argued with him, and confronted him about something very specific, a manuscript." Judith lowered her gaze. Gerard shifted in his chair. Marianne delicately crossed her legs. Only Alain seemed unfazed. Poirot continued. The manuscript in question was his true work, a testament disguised as fiction. Not the lukewarm novel that was eventually published, but the direct chronicle of a literary betrayal, a decades-long imposture. And that, he held up a bundle of loose pages, is what someone intended to burn in the fireplace. Marianne spoke for the first time, in a low voice. "And you? Do you have that manuscript?" "Almost complete," Poirot agreed, "thanks to fragments that weren't consumed by the fire, and thanks, Mademoiselle Judith, to your conscience." Judith shuddered. "I didn't want to protect anyone," he said with an effort. "I was just afraid of what it would mean if it got out, what it would reveal about all of us." Poirot watched her for a moment, then looked back at the others. "The most interesting thing about this story isn't the crime itself, but the silence that preceded it. Émile wasn't killed for what he wrote, but for what he was about to say." He slowly approached the desk and placed 3 versions of the final chapter on it. "Here," he said, pointing to the published version, "the protagonist withdraws from the world in melancholy. A harmless, gentle version. A falsehood." "Émile approved that version," Alain intervened. "Did you approve it?" Poirot repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or were you pressured into it? Or did someone submit it on your behalf?" Alain did not respond. Poirot continued, "In this other version, he lifted the one recovered from the ashes. The protagonist doesn't retreat. He makes the theft of his work public, confronts the impostor, and leaves a final warning. Masks can last for many years, but one word is enough for them to dissolve." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, a seagull squawked like a mocking echo. "That chapter was written with wine," Poirot said, lowering his voice. "Not because Émile was drunk, but because he didn't want his ink to be easily photocopied or reproduced. He knew that. He knew that if he wrote it with an ordinary pen and ink, anyone could destroy or falsify it. But wine, it leaves different traces." Gerard leaned forward. "Are you saying that? That father planned to be read after his death?" "I wasn't planning to die, Monsieur Gerard. I was planning to finally live without fear." Judith, her eyes glassy, spoke almost in a whisper. "He told me one night that he'd finally decided to sign his real name again, that he didn't care what others thought anymore, that he didn't need forgiveness, just their voice." Poirot nodded slowly. "And that decision was his sentence." Alain stood up suddenly with slow but tense movements. "Monsieur Poirot, what are you trying to do with all this? Rewrite history? Ruin us all because of a suspicion?" "No, monsieur," Poirot replied, staring at him. "I am only seeking the truth, and I am not alone. The manuscript contains it. The pages contain it. And there is something else." He went to the shelf and took out an envelope. A copy was sent by Émile to the notary in Honfleur, with an attached letter dated 2 days before his death. That letter will be opened today, in the presence of the prosecutor. Alain slowly slumped into his chair. "My God." Marianne whispered, "So, he knew?" "Yes," said Poirot. "He knew time was running out, that he couldn't trust everyone, but he could trust some. And in that final document, He wrote down who knew what, and who did what. Judith brought her hand to her lips. Poirot moved away from the desk. "I'll be back this afternoon. And then, with the permission of the law, I'll read that letter to everyone. Today, finally, the chapter Émile never saw in print will be read aloud." Chapter 17. The Letter That Didn't Want to Be Read. The library smelled of old paper, waxed wood, and dormant ashes. Outside, the wind had begun to roar louder, shaking the branches of the magnolia tree by the window. The clock read 5 in the afternoon. Judith stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, tense. Marianne, sitting in the farthest armchair, clutched the armrest with a gloved hand. Gérard paced back and forth without saying a word. Alain Montfort, like a living marble, kept his face turned toward the floor. Poirot entered with a firm stride, followed by the Honfleur notary, Monsieur Delafosse, a small man with a faint voice and an inquisitive look. He carried a leather briefcase and round glasses that kept slipping down his nose. "My friends," Poirot said solemnly, "we have reached the moment that Émile Grandjean foresaw with the lucidity of a man who no longer wished to hide. This document was delivered to Monsieur Delafosse with precise instructions. It was to remain sealed until today, unless his death occurred under unusual circumstances. And so it happened," the notary added, slowly opening the sealed envelope. He pulled out a sheet of paper folded in 3, written in neat, tight handwriting. The paper had dark stains, wine, perhaps, or dried blood, but the words were legible. Delafosse cleared his throat and began to read. "To whom it may concern, if this letter is being read, it is because I, Émile Grandjean, can no longer speak for myself. And because I suspect that someone close to me has chosen to silence my voice before it reveals a truth I have hidden for years, not out of cowardice but out of fear of the destruction it would cause. But now I know that destruction doesn't come from the truth. It comes from silence." Judith covered her mouth with her hand. Poirot didn't take his eyes off the notary. "For more than 20 years, I signed works that weren't entirely mine. I was an accomplice, sometimes a victim, sometimes a beneficiary of a pact of shadows. There was a name used, a pseudonym that concealed more than one author. Some of you know this. Some of you think I don't know. But I know more than you imagine." Delafosse looked up for a few seconds. A thick silence filled the room. "My true last work, the one I wrote with wine, not out of nostalgia but as a warning, contains a key. It doesn't just reveal the imposture, it reveals the exact moment I stopped being the author and began to be the witness." Marianne's eyes shone with anxiety. Gérard had stopped pacing. Alain wasn't moving. "I've also left a list, not of culprits, I don't judge, but of actions. Each of you will know upon reading your name what that gesture represents in which I decided to trust, or distrust." The notary took an additional sheet of paper out of the envelope. It was handwritten, with smudging ink, as if he had written it hastily or with trembling hands. Delafosse read the names and the sentences that followed. "Judith Lemoine, for keeping words that were not yours, for fear of causing harm where there was only truth. Gérard Grandjean, for despising what you didn't understand, but also for never having sold my notebooks. Marianne Duclos, for your aesthetic loyalty and your moral betrayal. Alain Montfort, for writing to me out loud while I was writing silently. And finally, for myself, Émile, for having remained silent when it was time to shout." The room was motionless. The letter ended with a cramped signature. "Émile Grandjean, October 3rd. The notary slowly folded the paper. Poirot took a few steps forward. See, Emile didn't directly accuse anyone, but he left a mirror, and in that mirror, each of you must look. And what do you expect us to do with that? Marianne asked, her voice thick with suppressed fury. Redeem ourselves? Kneel down? Poirot shook his head gently. I want you to listen, because the crime wasn't just Emile's death. It was everything that came before. The murder had already begun when someone decided to falsify a chapter, when someone hid a manuscript, when someone chose reputation over justice. Alain stood up suddenly. Enough! What if it was just suicide? An accident? Poirot turned to him with a hard look. Monsieur, do you think a man who leaves a letter like that doesn't know he's going to be silenced? Emile was prepared to die, yes, but not by his own hand. The clock struck a single chime, 5:30. Poirot lowered his voice. And now, I must show you something else. Something that was hidden in the back of the original manuscript. A fragment that someone wanted us not to see. An epilogue written in the same wine ink. He took a thin envelope out of his jacket. This epilogue doesn't mention a name, but it describes a visitor. Someone who came here the night before her death. Someone with a scar on their memory, and a lie too big to sustain any longer. Judith took a step back. Marianne narrowed her eyes. Gérard took a deep breath. Alain pressed his lips together, pale. Poirot slipped the envelope into his pocket and said softly, Tomorrow morning, when Inspector Dubois returns, we'll read that epilogue together. Then, mes amis, the fiction will be over. Chapter 18. The Last Epilogue. The next morning the Grandjean house awoke silently, as if the night had taken its final word and now awaited an inevitable judgment. Inspector Dubois arrived punctually, his face stern, notebook in hand. He entered the library accompanied by Poirot, who greeted him with a slight nod. Everyone else was already present, seated in an improvised semicircle, as if awaiting the reading of a sentence. Poirot placed the epilogue envelope on the polished wooden table. His moustache, immaculate as ever, barely moved as he spoke. My friends, the moment has come. Émile Grandjean wrote this final fragment not as an author, but as a victim. With wine ink, yes, the same ink someone tried to wash away, he recorded the visitor who crossed the line between lie and crime. He opened the envelope. He took out a stained sheet of paper. He held it carefully. Let me read it. He's come. I wasn't surprised to see him. Deep down, I always knew the time would come. He had in his eyes the desperation of someone who can no longer maintain the mask. He spoke to me in a low voice, but his words were knives wrapped in velvet. He asked me to destroy what I had written, to forget, to keep quiet. When I refused, his hand trembled, not from fear, but from determination. He left the room, leaving something behind, a veiled promise, an ancient threat. Tomorrow, he said, everything will vanish, and so it shall be. Poirot placed the sheet of paper on the table. There was a moment of silence. Then he straightened and scanned the room. His voice became firmer. The visitor was Marianne Duclos. Everyone turned to her. Marianne didn't move. Her face was a perfect mask, but her eyes burned with resigned rage. How do you know? He asked in a low voice. Because you were the only one Émile feared morally, not physically. You didn't need to use force. Your voice, your story, your shadow were enough. You were the true architect of the pseudonym you shared in your youth. Émile started by signing with you. Then you left him, and he continued, always feeling guilty. Your return to his life, months before his death, shook everything up. Marianne leaned forward. I didn't kill him. I confronted him, yes. I pressured him. but he was finished. "So why did you delete the epilogue from the manuscript?" asked Poirot. A murmur ran through the room. "Because I read it," she admitted. "And it horrified me. Not because of what it said, but because it revealed more about me than he had any right to say. I felt betrayed. I wanted to keep him from exposing himself. But I'd already written it," Poirot said gently. "And you came back that night." Marianne closed her eyes. "I came back. Yes, but not to kill him." "What happened was more subtle, mademoiselle. You didn't take his life with your own hands, but you pushed him to despair." Emile, already ill, drank more than he should have. You mixed medicines, and you, when you left, turned off the lamp. Knowing he was on the verge, you didn't act. You didn't intervene. Dubois looked up gravely. "That is a willful omission, madame." Marianne didn't defend herself. She just murmured, "I hated him," for telling the truth too late. Poirot lowered his voice. "The truth has no clocks. It comes when it can. And it kills, yes, but only if it is feared." Judith had tears in her eyes. Gerard looked at the ground, as if finally understanding that his father's death was not a simple tragedy, but a long-in-the-making act. Poirot gathered the papers meticulously. "And so, mes amis, the crime wasn't a knife or poison. It was an idea. It was the unbearable weight of a story that tried to hide itself for too long." Dubois approached Marianne. She stood up with dignity, without a word. When they left, silence returned. Poirot turned to the others. "Now, the only thing left is to decide whether the book will be published." Judith nodded, still trembling. "It will be published, with the epilogue." Gerard said nothing, but his eyes, for the first time, weren't filled with contempt. Poirot took his hat. "So, let it be read, let it be known, and let Émile Grandjean finally have the last word," as he himself wrote. He left the library with a slow but steady step. Outside, the wind had died down. The magnolia tree no longer shook. And on the desk, the final page of the manuscript remained open, as if the silence of the house were reading it as well.